Welcome to the final talk in the Drawing Vulnerability series, one of the two series that we, in a fit of absence of mind, started at the same time. We had a set of films being screened under screening vulnerability in the department, and parallel to that, we had this particular text as our focal point, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And because it's the 30th year, we thought we'll do something with comics and graphic novels as well. The mandate of the chair in vulnerability studies is to examine some specific forms of vulnerability, aging, social conditions of social justice or injustice, and climate change, among others. The chair, as a teaching and research unit, is supposed to offer talks, organize courses, conduct seminars, and the usual things that academic units do in and around the theme of vulnerability. This particular series was interested in looking at forms through which vulnerability may be communicated, questions of readership, but also questions of production, which is why the graphic novel. So in the previous sessions, as some of you may be aware, we had people speaking about their work in depicting, say, famines and starvation deaths. We had people doing pathographics. And today we'll be looking at autographics, self-representations, and the graphic novel form. So this, I think, is a hugely successful series that we have had, thanks to our speakers and a very enthusiastic audience that we have had. And as one of the early programs of the chair, we're very grateful to all of you, especially people and speakers from Europe and the United States who have had to juggle time zones to be here at what would be reasonably rational times for us in terms of audience reception. So I will now hand this over to Atul and Meenakshi to run. Thank you, Maria, from all of us here at the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maya. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. Hello, Maria. If I may formally introduce you to the audience, Professor Maria Porras Sánchez is an assistant professor at the Department of English Studies at the Complutense University of Madrid. She has formerly taught at the Aberystwyth University, Nebria University, and the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. Her main research areas are graphic narratives and comics, literary translation, and post-colonial and transnational literatures in English, with an interest on themes such as precarity, migration, otherness, and myth, and the intersections with race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality, from modernism to the present. She currently lectures to undergraduate and postgraduate students on courses dealing with modernist fiction, post-colonial literatures, ethnicity literatures, and literary translation. She has co-edited with Gerardo Vilches, Precarious Youth in Contemporary Graphic Narratives, Young Lives in Crisis, published by Routledge in 2022, and with Esther Sanchez Pardo and Rosa Barillo, Women Poets and Myth in the 20th and 21st Centuries, on Sappho's website. She has translated more than 30 works, including novels, essays, young adult fiction, and illustrated books. She has edited and translated Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, by Mona El-Tahawi, Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot, published in 2022 by Mickey Kendall, and The Address Book, What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power, by Deirdre Mask in 2023. Her last work to date is the volume Myth and Environmentalism, Arts of Resilience for a Damaged Planet, published by, which is forthcoming from Routledge in 2023 and is co-edited with Esther Sanchez Pardo. With this, may I now invite Professor Maria Sánchez for her lecture, please.
Thank you, Abdul, for your kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me well. And well, good afternoon to everyone. It is a great pleasure to be invited to participate in this series of talks to discuss vulnerability in comics, or vulnerability and comics. And I want to thank Professor Nayar and the rest of the organizers of the UNESCO Chair, Menaxi, Abdul, for their kind invitation and their flexibility upon agreeing on the details of this talk. So I'm going to start sharing my presentation, if you allow me a second. Okay. Oh. I hope you can see it. You can interrupt me if you don't. I won't be seeing you.
See it, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll start by explaining very briefly what brings me here, apart from your kind invitation, which is my my former connection with the vulnerability in comics, which takes different forms. As Abdul has been kindly mentioning, I have co-edited with Gerardo Vilches Precarious Youth in Contemporary Graphic Narratives, Young Life in Crisis, and we have collaborated as well in a couple of articles about young Spanish authors and precarity. So part of my theoretical background today for this talk is our background is a joint work that we have been developed in the last days, although the analysis and the examples, of course, are my own work. Also, this teaching innovation project brings me here. It's something I have been doing with a student and colleague at Complutense University in the last 3-4 years. This is a reading club in which we read graphic narratives with an ethic content, and we have workshops as well. So many of the examples included here today in this talk belong to this reading club. There are students of mine present; they will recognize them all. I have written as well on my own several chapters on representations of vulnerability in comics, mostly in refugee comics. I have attended several roundtables with very good Spanish colleagues about vulnerability in literature and other cultural products. And also recently I've been translating a graphic memoir, Commute, which is a feminist graphic memoir about abuse and rape by Erin Williams for a Spanish publisher. It is forthcoming. I don't have yet the cover. So my talk today is grounded on these previous works and experiences, and today I'll start with a historical approach to comics and vulnerable lives, then followed by a theoretical background. Then I'll present a panel of forms of vulnerability as represented in comics to provide as many examples as possible of how comics approach vulnerability in aesthetic terms in different comics traditions. Then I'll analyze 3 autographics, that is autobiographical and autofictional comics as defined by Gillian Whitlock. And in this comics, I argue that vulnerability can be considered a form of precarious identity. I apologize beforehand if my approach is largely Eurocentric and Anglocentric. English studies is my area of expertise, and I cannot escape my perspective. I'll try to palliate my shortcomings by introducing works of authors belonging to minorities within larger national contexts, women authors, and LGBTQI authors. So as part of mass culture, comics have historically portrayed poverty, frequently in association with young characters, as Gerardo Vilches and myself state in Precarious Youth in Contemporary Graphic Narratives. US classic comic strips from the beginning of the 20th century for the 1910s, 20s and 30s used to include stereotypes such as the hobo, happy hooligan, or the orphan, Little Orphan Annie by Oppe and by Harold Gray, respectively. Although they served as social commentary and also for raising empathy with the poor and the wealthy elites, these representations of precarious realities served mostly comical purposes, and this also is the case of the famous strip Hogan's Alley by Otcult, home of the famous Yellow Kid. you know, this is the first comic strip that includes a balloon, and it was a device that was incorporated to many comics, had to travel to Europe and elsewhere later. The yellow kid at the beginning wasn't yellow, by the way, but then later acquired its usual iconography. In Spain, characters such as Carpanta, whose comic trait was an unremitting hunger, showed the hard living conditions under the Spanish dictatorship, but the implicit criticism was a subtext underlying humor. And in fact, these comics escaped censorship, although at a certain point, instead of saying hunger, the character had to say appetite or something less with a less strong connotations. It was with the rise of adult comics that the precarious condition began to be openly represented from a critical perspective. In many instances, the precarious working conditions were connected to narratives of precarity. For instance, the first adult comics movement, Japanese gekiga, meaning dramatic drawing, appeared in the precarious context of Osaka's manga rental market in the late 1950s, where the work of several artists were printed in collections that readers borrowed from stores and then returned. Authors such as Yoshiharu Tsuge or Yoshihiro Tatsumi, whose adult characters strive to find their way in post-war Japan, are frequently presented as jobless and hopeless, caught in an impasse of unhappy relationships without any prospect of a better life. In the U.S., underground comics authors such as Robert Crumb, Gilbert Shelton, Spain Rodriguez, Alan Kominsky, or Diane Newman laid the foundations for Western nonfiction comics, a category which is directly connected to the representation of precarity, with their depiction of bohemians without money and without jobs. Thanks to underground comics, the comics medium revealed itself as being perfectly suitable for autobiography and related narratives such as autofiction, memoir, documentary, or essay, because it established a particular relationship between author and their own body through its representation, what is known as embodiment, but it also built a reader's emotional engagement with the protagonist. According to Elizabeth L. Refay. For instance, The Bunch, Alan Kominsky's alter ego from the late 1970s to the 1990s. I'm sorry because I'm mixing sometimes editions. This is the US edition. This is the Spanish translation because the quality was better. I didn't have a good quality for these pages. Also sorry about this strange combination. So this alter ego, The Bunch, is a vulnerable and confused teenager who suffers rape and sexual abuse when looking for sentimental partners. Kominsky's work starts a long list of women artists who document trauma and abuse in their autobiographic works. Authors such as Debbie Dreschler, Phoebe Gleckner, Marjane Satrapi, Linda Barry, all these women authors included in Hilary Chut's book, Graphic Women, published in 2010. Later on, Arte Spiegelman's Mouse became a milestone, as we all know, in nonfiction comics and a powerful influence on many artists to introduce trauma, abuse, or discrimination in their works. As Hilary Chut states, it is, and I quote, a manner of testifying that sets a visual language in motion with and against the verbal in order to embody individual and collective experience, to put contingent selves and histories into form. In a similar vein, collectives and minorities have also found a voice in comics in the last decades, showing what Jack Halberstam calls the queer alliance of the dispossessed and the precarious. Many LGBTIQ narratives underline the author's vulnerability and the continuous negotiation within a heteronormative context, such as Kabi Nagata's My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness or Maya Kobabe's Y and the Queer. When defining the precarious condition, Gerardo Vilches and I have written that it is a defining motif of contemporary culture worldwide, since social and individual vulnerability, objective and systemic violence, labor-based insecurity, and different forms of instability haunt a neoliberal world in crisis. For Judith Butler, in many different works, although today I'll be quoting from Frames of War, precarity and precariousness are two forms of vulnerability. Since all human lives are vulnerable, subject to illness, violence, and death, precariousness is understood as an existential state of life, the recognition, and I quote, that life requires various social and economic conditions to be met in order to be sustained as a life, end quote. Thus, precariousness is the shared human condition that makes all individuals intrinsically interdependent in their vulnerability. While precariousness is an existential category, precarity is a more political notion, alluding to the manifestations of vulnerability that are politically induced. Butler notes that, and I quote, those whose lives are not regarded as potentially grievable and hence valuable are made to bear the burden of starvation, underemployment, legal disenfranchisement, and differential exposure to violence and death, end quote. In a neoliberal global context in which capitalism seemingly occupies the horizons of the thinkable, as Mark Fisher famously claimed, fragmented and weakened social structures lead to fragmented lives, a crucial aspect that defines Zygmunt Bauman's concept of liquid modernity, metaphorically evoked by Spanish author Marta Cartu in her comic Hola Siri. You can say the waves of this liquid modernity. It was a constant metaphor she had in mind when she was creating this. The individuals who populate the present historical condition of globalized capitalism are marked by what Bauman calls the unholy trinity of uncertainty, insecurity, and unsafety that define liquid modernity. In such a context, precarity has become a recurrent motif in contemporary culture, as Lauren Berland explains to you. And I quote, new aesthetic forms emerged during the 1990s to register a shift in how the older state liberal capitalist fantasies shape adjustments to the structural pressures of crisis and loss that are wearing out the power of the good life's traditional fantasy bribe without wearing out the need for a good life. It's important to be reminded that even if precarity is an after effect of an exploitative neoliberal world, its representation does not offer a nostalgic picture of an old world order. For some authors, there is a sense of loss in contrast with their previous generation, the loss of the good life that Berland alluded to. But even in those cases, the past is not romanticized. What do graphic narratives about precarity offer, if not a reimagined future nor a romanticized past? Well, they confront the radical present not as a nostalgic recreation, but as an acknowledgement of their existential precariousness as affected by different forms of precarity. By doing so, they invite the reader, through the collaborative nature of the form, as stated by Kate Pollack, to share and relive those experiences, to partake of their precarious condition. And this is possible because the formal qualities of graphic narratives, including the gutter, the staging of point of view, and the textual imagistic hybridity, make them uniquely suited to questions relating to how we negotiate representations of extremity, because there are staging of the gaze and the staging of questions surrounding both how and what we remember prompts reader to consider their emotional and ethical relationships to the text, end quote. This approach entails an ethical engagement between the viewer and the authors, the viewer, reader, and the author, which in autographics is also the protagonist. As Professor Nayar has pointed out in the human rights graphic novel, these kinds of narratives enable, and I quote, a narration and, more importantly, a visualization of vulnerability, trauma, witnessing, resilience, and resistance, so as to produce the structure of feelings of empathy, sympathy, and politically charged emotions central to human rights, end quote. In the case of autographics, I argue that the self-representation of vulnerability and its intersections with different forms of precarity call for an open identification between authors and readers, contributing to create what Thomas Clavier calls a precarious community. Now, I like to show you a gallery of examples of images to exemplify different forms of vulnerability in a wide variety of comics traditions, aesthetics, registers. Most of them are autobiographics. Some of them might be considered coming-of-age stories or family stories. There are essay-like approaches and metaphorical approaches. Others include humor, self-irony, or grotesquerie. I like you to have an idea of the wide variety of representation, self-representations mostly, of vulnerability in comics. Since precarity does not affect all individuals in the same way, I'm interested in tracing the representations of vulnerability that affect those with less privileges in account of their race, ethnicity, sexual identity, gender, age, or class. I start with race and identity with this example. This is the cover of They Call Us Enemy, which shows the cowering face of a child who is George Takei, the author and the protagonist of this autobiographic work. He's waiting on the line prior to his incarceration in an internment camp for Japanese Americans during World War II in US soil. The contrast between the line, the powerlessness, and the oppression symbolized by the camp and the soldier looking in the background clash with the imploring gesture of the boy, who turns to the spectator as if asking for their protection, or with a silent question: why me? Why us? A very different example. This panel shows racial slurs in Linda Barry's 100 Demons. It's a comic that I'll analyze in detail later and see how the tone and the register and style, everything changes in this example by Malka Gariba. It was their American Dream, which includes a microaggression bingo, recollecting the racist comments that the Filipino, Egyptian American author has endured during his years of youth. Class is central in Wage Slaves by Daria Bogdanska. As a Polish student in Sweden, Bogdanska tries to find a job to support herself, but she finds out that in order to work in the country legally, she needs an identity card that is only issued once a job is secured. So this bureaucratic maze makes her accept salaries below the minimum wage in places that, of course, don't respect any regulation, in which the worker is very fragile and an object of exploitation. Without energy to draw and very little money, she can't even afford to buy winter clothes in second-hand shops, so she resorts to shoplifting, as in here. The migrant condition is, of course, a site of vulnerability that even continues once the migrant has reached their destination. Migrant narratives usually illustrate that sense of alienation and the othering and exclusion of migrants. This page is from Halat by Italian author Julia Pez, although this edition is French because the quality was very good and I picked it. Show with lyricism the impasse that refugee camps represent, a known place which is anonymous, bleak, and threatening a poor remediation of a home. In the case of sexual identity and gender, many LGBTIQ narratives give visibility to vulnerability. P, the author's alter ego in P, La Mia Adolescencia Trans, deplores how she is objectified because she refuses to accept the gender binaries man-woman as a non-binary trans person. Another example from the web series Youssef and Farhad by Amir Soltani and Khalil Bendib that depict the struggle of gay love in Iran in a collaboration with the LGBTIQ human rights organization Outright Action International. This is accessible, this is online, you can find it and read the whole web series. As I have mentioned before, women authors have been using comics for many decades to evoke trauma and abuse, but also to denounce and fight sexism, as this page by Moroccan author Zainab Fasiki illustrates. The same woman subject to the surveillance of this big eye of representing all men. In fact, the word here is rajul, meaning man. Regardless of the modesty of her attire, she is nevertheless objectified. Health and ability or disability are very relevant sides of vulnerability, and you know this because of your previous talk on graphic pathographies, and the examples are very numerous. Dancing After 10 is a stunning work. Vivian Chong narrates her own skin disease, 10, which is toxic epidermal necrolysis, that could leave her eventually blind. So she started to work on it when she was losing her sight to document the experience. And not only that, but she teamed up with Georgia Weber, whose graphic autobiography, Damn, chronicled also her own disability, to complete a work which is an immense feat, which is paradoxically a work that conveys sightlessness through drawing, and in which you can see the decline of her sight throughout the graphic, throughout the walk, because you can see that the strokes are weaker or are actually bigger, or you can see how they are also in decline in a certain way, or how they are panicked, or so it's a very emotional walk. As for mental health, Catherine de Meurice delves into post-traumatic stress syndrome and depression in her memoir La Légèreté, written to cope with the guilt and sadness after the terrorist attack against the magazine Charlie Hebdo. She was not killed or injured because she arrived late that day. Age is also a site of vulnerability, whether affecting young lives or the elderly. Representations of children as affected by precarity are very numerous in fiction, and also as recollections in autographics, such as this by African-American author Ebony Flowers, who describes her life in a caravan park and in a poor neighborhood with numerous allusions to child abuse. Although identity politics are frequently predicated upon the separating out of many kinds of experience that actually blend together, intersect, and mix, as defined by Jack Halberstam, those identities have vulnerability in common. As Butler suggests, vulnerable lives are more grievable when exposed and acknowledged, then representations of vulnerable identities might offer a site of resistance against precarity. In this sense, I totally agree with Professor Susan Esquire the other day in her talk, Finding Health in Vulnerability. Vulnerability can be a site of resistance. As it can be inferred from the previous examples, vulnerability in its different intersections is approached from a wide variety of aesthetics, from the oversimplified lines and the histrionic yellow in P, La Mi Adolescencia Trans, to the schematism and the repetitions in Commute by Erin Williams used to stress the male gaze of the stalker that objectifies the protagonist, to the cartoonish characters and diagrams illustrating the infinite cycle of precarity, as used by Ana Belén Rivero. You see that here she writes, "Siempre seré pobre, I'll always be poor." So precarity is everywhere. Is the theme of this graphic memoir. Then we go to the grotesque and cartoonish anthropomorphism as used by Roberta Vázquez in Socorro. She represents herself as this pretzel, who's a precarious artist, a precarious comics artist that suffers all kind of neglect from the editors, and who lives in a very small place. And even when Prezzolino becomes famous, he still becomes stuck in this small flat where he draws, but it's also the place where he washes the dishes and also his armpits, as he's saying here. Then we have the cute style and soft lines of Ana Oncina in Los Fucking 30, where she tells of her difficulties earning a living as an artist and finding a decent flat. In these two manga examples, the aesthetic varies from the chibi kawaii style with good doses of histrionics of Japanese author Kabi Nagata to the dramatic combination of anthropomorphic characters. These birds, this is Pum Pum, the protagonist, and his family, they are all represented as these birds, combined with the realistic backgrounds based in photographs and the grotesque characters. This is Inio Asano's Goodnight Pum Pum, and Jose Andres Santiago has a very good study of this manga. Visual metaphors also abound, as in this one by Yuna, representing the roots of the protagonist's trauma and the weight of sexual abuse, or Maya Kobabe's depicting the complexities of queerness outside gender binary. Graphic autobiographies tend to avoid a realistic approach, as we see, although documentary comics might present a higher level of iconicity. This page, with a photograph and a map by Peruvian author Jesus Cosillo, shows that the need to document goes hand in hand with a more realistic style. This is not always the case, as in Grass by Korean author Keun-suk Gentry Kim, who retells the story of a survivor of sexual slavery, Ok-sun Lee, who was kidnapped by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. Here, the author's style is usually schematic, but very expressive, with simple ink strokes. but it becomes expressionistic in its crudest moments. She also uses ellipses to preserve the dignity of Oksun, as here with this landscape, when she tells about the first time that she was raped. This is a depiction of a woman whose baby had been taken away from her after giving birth within a brothel, and of course as a product of rape. The fact that most of graphic biographies and autobiographies are not realistic does not entail a lesser ethical engagement reader-author, in fact, or reader-protagonist. In fact, it's quite the contrary. According to MacLeod's theory on cartooning, and I don't agree with many theories by MacLeod, since comic studies has been a field of study that have developed a lot since he wrote Understanding Comics, but it was a fundamental work for comic studies. It was a seminal work, and some of his principles still are very, very valid. And I think cartooning is one of the finest points in this theory. So cartooning, according to MacLeod, is a form of amplification through simplification. When we abstract an image through cartooning, we are not so much eliminating details as we are focusing on specific details. By stripping down an image to its essential meaning, an artist can amplify that meaning in a way that realistic art can't. The amplification of meaning through cartooning opens the way for an identification reader-protagonist, since the schematic image is more universal. As they say here, when you see this cartoon, you see yourself. The visualization of vulnerability matches Hilary Chut's ideas on self-representation. Now, quote, "The visualization of the ongoing procedure of self and subjectivity constructs ordinary experience as relevant and political, claiming a space in public discourse for resistance." End of quote. By inscribing themselves on the page of their creations, practicing embodiment, authors give testimony of their vulnerability, but also make a statement out of it. They claim, as artist Onkawara did with his famous telegrams sent to known and unknown recipients. He sent almost 900 of them. He claims, "I am still alive" in most of them. Well, these artists, these authors, these creators, they are still alive despite everything that had happened to them: precarity, violence, discrimination, abuse, trauma, exclusion, or alienation. This statement is a way of appropriating their own vulnerability and using it to define themselves, not in a limiting way as an imposition from the outside world, as it often happens with identity markers, which are imposed from the outside, but as one more layer to add in the complex apparatus that is personal experience. Now, I'd like to approach 3 autographics in more detail, since these examples, this gallery had been a general panorama. So I want to delve deeper into them, so to explore the intersections of different forms of vulnerability that give way to a vulnerable identity that calls from an open identification between authors and readers. I'll start with Linda Barry's 100 Demons. She was born in 1956 and began her career as a cartoonist in the late 1970s. Of Filipino, Irish, and Norwegian descent, she grew up in a working-class, racially mixed neighborhood in Seattle. She explores her precarious childhood and adolescence in 100 Demons, a work she defines, and you have here the name, the difficult word, autobifictionalography. A collection of 18 comics strips separated by collages, reproducing real stories which are partly fictionalized. As she explains in the back cover of the book, these demons are the life moments that haunt you, form you, and stay with you. Your worst boyfriend, kickball games on a summer night, watching your baby brother dancing and realizing your childhood is over. The strips recreate Linda's coming of age through episodes of ridicule, loss, or trauma, different angles in which precarity is central. In the introductory section, Linda Barry explains how she read about an exercise of 16th century Zen painting, which consisted on drawing 100 demons. Barry invites the reader to draw and dig their own demons as a way of giving visibility to their own vulnerability. In fact, the last pages of the comic include photographs and precise instructions for using similar drawing materials. This identification emphasizes precariousness as understood by Judith Butler as a form of shared vulnerability. Giving shape to her childhood demons is a way of exercising them, while encouraging readers to do the same is invoking a collective exorcism. Her book becomes what she calls a magic lantern, so a guide, a personal memento meant to comfort others as well. Barry, cartoonish, playful, Goldie styles helps her to address serious themes such as abuse, racism, and alienation without dramatism. Identifying and drawing demons, transforming their nightmarish nature into cute, sparkling things, is a strategy for conjuring and encapsulating them within the limits of the comic strip. The Precarious format, including the use of cheap yellow legal paper at the beginning and end and recycled items on the collages between the strips, mirrors the Precarious context. Chute connects Barry's collage technique, which also incorporates photographs, to the fragmentary nature of traumatic memory. And another critic, Kunka, says that it also evokes a handmade quality that lends itself to a sense of authenticity. Barry depicts her childhood and adolescence as an awkward period marked by intense feeling of alienation derived from her Filipino roots, the lack of money at home, the premature use of alcohol and drugs. She takes mescaline, speed, as said before turning 16, and the verbal abuse of her mother, a refugee raised during the war in Philippines. Her multicultural working-class neighborhood is not exempt of racism, but it is also the site of fleeting moments of happiness and amazement. Instead of focusing on a single event or approaching her subject chronologically, Barry uses different life moments that symbolically evoke her coming of age. So there are many comings of age. The loss of a boyfriend who committed suicide, the estrangement from her lifelong friend when she enters high school, or her self-consciousness when she is told that she is a bad dancer for the first time. One of the episodes that illustrates best her loss of innocence is resilience. Starting as a reflection, when did I become a teenager? The strip shows a 13-year-old Barry who feels depressed and anxious. Circumventing the subject, readers need to fill the gaps to understand that she suffered sexual abuse when she was a little girl, as represented here in the last panel. Resilience is an ironic title. And she says here, this ability to exist in pieces is what some adults call resilience, a horrible resilience that makes adults believe children forget trauma. Self-destructive tendencies such as heavy drinking, drugs, or casual sex help her to cope with the repressed memories that threaten to resurface. So she clings to that exhilarated feeling. I became a teenager when I discovered how to give myself that feeling of wholeness, she says. However, Barry's portrayal of adolescence is not bitter, but a bright, sometimes grotesque, sometimes endearing recreation, just like her colorful colleges, full of bling-bling monsters. Although vulnerability has shaped Barry's childhood and adolescence, it has not defined her identity exclusively. Growing up as a poor, awkward, and alienated girl has made an impact on the adult. But regardless of her childhood and teenage demons, the adult Linda is represented as a functional grown-up. Her previous experience has made her aware of the precariousness of life. As an adult, she feels a blankness when a teenage neighbor commits suicide, relieving the loss of a boyfriend when she was 14. She offers to clean the garage where the body was found. The nectarines she finds there, so real, perishables, act as a visual metaphor of our existential precariousness. Is it possible for the past to be over? The narrator asks herself. The answer seems negative, but undramatic, non-epiphanic. Her precarious comings of age might have left her scarred, yet showing herself as a fulfilled woman proves that those demons have been exorcised. And this is a graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do, by Thi Bui, who was born in Wharton, Saigon in 1978, then migrated by boat to Malaysia with her family when she was 3, and then they were granted asylum in the US. This graphic memoir is an account of a vulnerable migrant childhood and youth marked by precarity and uncertainty. In a double page at the beginning of her memoir, Thi Bui summarizes the recent history of Vietnam. Following suit, there is a full page of her body in labor, ready to give birth to her first son in the US. This way, the author connects Vietnam and the US, past and present, the historical and the familiar, the collective and the personal. Her story is an attempt to understand and become closer to her parents, thinking that if I bridged, and I'm quoting from here, thinking that if I bridged the gap between past and present, I could fill the void between my parents and me. And that if I could see Vietnam as a real place, not as a symbol of something lost, I could see my parents as real people and learn to love them better. The author emphasizes these words graphically by creating a visual analogy. Thi as a child with a map of Vietnam inscribed in her back, the same silhouette faintly lurking in the background of the page, mingling with the boat that took the family out of the country and far from the war. That mark is also an emotional scar, the reminder of the loss and grief inherited from her parents, that is generational trauma. The memoir becomes a reversal journey, a symbolic boat trip to Vietnam, to the past, the memories, and the histories of her parents. First, Bui focuses on the birth of her siblings and herself, all of them marked by precarity in war-torn Vietnam. Even if her parents did the best they could do, this is something, the central idea, of course, is in the title, that is key to understand the empathy between that Thi builds, the empathy that Thi builds for her parents. So in face of systemic violence, that sentence equates acknowledging their powerlessness to face the extreme circumstances surrounding them. The best they could do is acknowledging how precarity limits their chances of survival, no matter how hard they tried. Bui's father, Nam, grows up in French Indochina, surrounded by hunger, deprivation, and violence. Possibly suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, he never overcame the terror that made him vulnerable, becoming a threatening figure for his children later. As Bui reflects, I had no idea that the terror I felt was only the long shadow of his own. Nam is an ambivalent figure for his daughter, who also presents him as a hero, becoming the improvised helmsman of the boat that takes them to Malaysia. In turn, Bui's mother, Hang, had a privileged childhood attending French schools and living in a big house. War and hardship made of her a determined, resourceful woman, the provider of the family in times of need. Bui devotes less space to describe her own childhood in the US than to the stories of her parents. When she does it, precarity is overwhelming. Huddling together with more than 15 relatives in the same house in Indiana, sleeping in the same room with the rest of the family in a small dark flat in California, being ill frequently, surrounded by racism, never having money except for the most basic things, her parents earning minimum wages while studying in college at night, since their degrees were no longer useful in the US. As a contrast, there is the pride of being like her siblings, a gifted student, always top of her class. But apart from grief and tenacity, she has inherited from her parents her ability to survive. One day, after some oxygen tanks explode in the flat underneath theirs, the family calmly leaves the house one by one after taking all the valuable documents stored throughout the years in different folders, one for each member of the family. And I quoting from here, this, not any particular piece of Vietnamese culture, is my inheritance, the inexplicable need and extraordinary ability to run when the shit hits the fan. My refugee reflex, that was supposed to be the first option for the title, but then she learned that other encompass better the themes of the graphic memoir. At the end, she and her husband aspire to do the best they can do with their infant son. In a revealing full-page panel, Thi represents herself going to feed her newborn baby to the incubator with the most heroic deeds in her parents' history. The father at the rudder of the boat, her mother giving birth to her brother in the refugee camp, and her crossing the street, while the text reads, "The first week of parenting was the hardest week of my life, and the only time I ever felt called upon to be heroic. However much my body wanted to rest, a force pulled me onto my feet with a clear and simply directive: keep him alive." As a second-generation migrant, her inheritance to her child will be freedom from war and loss, that is, from the traumatic memories of her parents, not survival. Mirroring the precarious life it recreates, Boyce's style is bare, frugal, yet highly expressive. She uses black ink and a pale orange watercolor, which reminds the reader of rust or dried blood, and sometimes uses it to intensify dramatism. Also, the use of a single color may be a strategy for underlining this inextricable connection between the author, her parents, their history, and her future. Now I'm going with an author of a different generation, born in the early 1990s, Palestinian-American Yasmin Omar Atta is a Muslim, queer, and trans comic artist. In their debut in a long format, Atta uses autofiction and introduces a fictional avatar addressed with his pronouns for exploring their own experience with epilepsy and mental health. Mishhadra, the title, has a double meaning. Misadra without H means seizure or captivation in Arabic, while Mishhadra with H means I can't or cannot in dialectal Palestinian Lebanese Arabic. The pun in the title encapsulates the main themes in the graphic novel. Isaac is epileptic, and although he is diagnosed, the treatment is inadequate. Because of his illness and unsupported by his family, Isaac starts to lose control of his life and his seizures get worse. According to Atta, self-representation helped them to process their epilepsy and their estrangement with their father. And I quote from this interview, pretty much everything that's happened in the book, with some exceptions and rearranging, has happened to me. This is all sort of a reversioning and in my own way a processing of these events, end quote. Addressing their own vulnerability, their comic was a form of what he calls an art therapy, which helped them to cope with the situation. Illness is yet another form of vulnerability that autographists have approached profusely in the last decade, as the work of graphic medicine show. And these narratives become a testimonial representation of personal trauma in which authors can dissociate themselves from their illness while at the same time analyzing them. For Elizabeth El Rifai, autobiographical comics dealing with illness usually focus on representing the body. Such pictorial embodiment, this is her own words, is an active cultural process of rendering the body meaningful. In fact, Atta devotes most of Mishhadra to recreate Isaac's body as symbolically attacked by the seizures, represented as daggers with eyes and strings of beds. Epilepsy is associated with violent convulsions, but readers never see those. We don't see those convulsions. They are not represented. Whenever Isaac has a seizure, the comic the narrator, the visualization is focused on his mind. When he's under the effect of his illness, Isaac's world becomes darker. Even the frames of the panels become blurry or unstable. They create a strong contrast with what is happening in the real world, where pink, peach, and purple colors predominate and frames are regular and straight, as you can see. When epilepsy threatens to destabilize him, the daggers and the strings appear on the real world too. To recreate a dreamlike state known as complex partial status epilepticus, CPSE, a non-convulsive seizure, Atta presents Isaac interacting with the real world and the world of epilepsy, showing the plasticity of their formal strategy. With this duality, Atta wanted to show, and I quote from the same interview as before, the part where I'm really trying to function properly in this society, and then inside, there's this frustration that I can really compartmentalize in my day-to-day. Isaac's vulnerability is highlighted by the extended visual metaphor of the seizures. Towards the end of the graphic novel, it becomes evident that they stand for his illness, but also for depression, fostered by his refusal to accept the former. Fracture provoked by illness and also isolation is evoked by the fragmentary nature of Atta's representation. At the end, Isaac reacts and decides to try to take back the reins of his life. Embracing his illness and accepting his own vulnerabilities illustrated through a symbolic eye opening. His eye is open. He takes a soul dagger, which closes his threatening eye, surrendering to Isaac's will, and he stabs himself harmlessly, opening the eyes to the real world, ready to take a step forward. And now I'm moving to my conclusions. We can go back to any of these examples later if you want during question time. Historically, comics have frequently addressed vulnerability in different formats, traditions, aesthetics, and genres. In the last decades, coinciding with the increasing number of publications of documentary comics, graphic journalism, graphic essays, and autographics, vulnerability has become even more present, coinciding with precarity as a defining motif of contemporary culture. If, according to Butler's ideas on precariousness, the body is vulnerable, then all lives are equally perishable. The representation of the body in autographics, that is, the embodiment, always takes the center position in these works, whether distorted, grotesque, torn, repeated, exaggerated, cute, crude, or simplified. The visualization of such precarious bodies made them more grippable in Butler's terminology, their exposure a reminder of how fragile all bodies are, even the readers. The works of these three comics authors previously analyzed, among many others approached via examples, show the intersections of vulnerability with gender, race, health, class, sexual identity, etc. Even if their creators share their traumatic memories while facing different forms of uncertainty, insecurity, and unsafety, they, and I'm quoting Chute, do not project an identity that is defined by trauma. They work to erase the description in that space, end quote. Traumatic as their reality might be, their identity is not defined by this condition. They use the comics medium for asserting their presence and conjuring some of the negative aspects of precarity. This way, vulnerability, when recreated on the page on the author's terms with the author's style and resources, becomes visible, accessible, commodified. These authors do project an identity that is defined by vulnerability, not trauma. But such vulnerability is no longer harmful, since it has been exercised through its multifarious recreation in their comics. Acknowledging their vulnerability opens up an interesting possibility, since according to Butler, recognition wields the power to reconstitute vulnerability. This way, recognizing vulnerability becomes a form of empowerment. By acknowledging their own vulnerability, these creators activate a mechanism of resistance and agency. In addition, a vulnerable identity is a marker that different collectives and minorities have in common, contributing to create a precarious community which fosters solidarity, resistance, and equity between disenfranchised individuals and groups. Finally, all the mentioned examples call for an open identification between authors and readers. Readers, too, can become members of this precarious community, even if their experiences are dissimilar from the authors. They function at a political level and at an emotional level. As ethical statements, these comics bear witness, expose trauma, raise empathy, appropriate vulnerability, and invite readers to partake of the precarious condition. A shared vulnerability which creates a regenerative source of identification and new forms of community, which is, well, after all, an optimistic note in these liquid times. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sanchez. That was fascinating. We will now open this up for questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Of course, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Just for the audience, you could click on the raise hand option and we'll call your names out, or you could type your question in the chat box and we can read it out. There could be questions, comments, responses. Yes, Shruti, please go ahead.
Buenos días, Maria.
Buenos días.
I actually have a question. Do you think that narrating trauma through these comics and graphic novels, do you think it can actually inculcate and bring up a feeling of trauma again in the readers?
That's a very wonderful question, Shruti. And this is a question I've asked myself many times, especially, but not when dealing with autobiographical comics, but rather with representations of precarious lives. That is, for instance, migrant lives as represented by by authors who are not actually migrants themselves, but are witness to that trauma. And it's a question that plagues also critics of trauma studies. Can traumatic representations recreate trauma on readers? If we have in mind, for instance, if we apply this to readings for young people, for kids, or for addressed to middle grade readers, things like that. If we address those realities, are going to traumatize these children if they are addressing traumatizing events? My answer is that some of them do, because some of them try to dramatize the experience, try to exaggerate the experience, and sometimes they focus on a single aspect on that experience, reinforcing certain stereotypes that we find also in other media, in the news, or in journals. So sometimes they do. When they offer a simplified portrayal, I think sometimes they reinforce a certain stereotype that can be very damaging for those for the people they are trying to represent. But I think that autographics are free from that threatening aspect, let's call it like that, since it's first of all, they are very personal, and yet they engage you. But I think they, of course, if you are writing about yourself, you are writing about yourself with a certain intention, and you are writing about yourself to exorcise those demons. I think that giving visibility to those, and we've seen a wide variety of examples that use irony, use striking colors, or use visual metaphors to hide events which are very harmful, cannot traumatize, I think, at least not in the examples I've found so far. So perhaps in the future I'll find one, but at this point I haven't. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Oh, you did. Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. I don't know if there are other questions on the chat, or if you have any other questions. I think Cristina Gamez has a question in the chat. I gather from your conclusion that effects in the three autographics studied point toward positive ones like optimism or hope. Would you mind commenting a bit more on the potential of these effects in dealing with vulnerability and precarities? So I think that by using autographics as a form of art therapy, as Yasmin Omar Atta declares his autographics to be, although the comic is a fictionalized version of himself, but for him was a form of art therapy, already implies a positive aspect, that is giving visibility to vulnerability, to precarity, is already a form of resistance, is already a form of healing, is already a form of raising hope and trying to overcome the impact of trauma in this life. So definitely there is in these three narratives there the hope element is very evident, even if the events they narrate can be very, very harmful, or can be very, very damaging, since they all have in mind that this source of autographics might help them overcome what has happened. So it's it happens with Linda Barry. The book conveys a sense of agency, very, very strong. And since the very beginning, it's an invitation to exorcise your own demons and to overcome trauma by addressing it, by approaching it, or in a playful, gaudy, artistic style. So I think the connotation, the hope there is very evident. And of course, also in the case of Bui, the comic becomes an artifact to overcome generational trauma and to understand the past of her parents better, and her own connection to Vietnam, which is no longer her homeland. Her homeland, in fact, is her family, which is a constant in migrant narratives, as you are very well, I'm sure. So I think, yes, I think hope is there. Is just the way, just the standing point, the starting point of deciding to write down an autobiographic story and giving visibility without any qualms to that vulnerable to that vulnerable situations is a form of conjuring vulnerability, and it's a form of raising hope, I think. So I don't know if you have any more questions. You're welcome, Cristina. There's another one.
Hi, Maria. My question's actually very connected to what Christina just asked you. In fact, it stems from there. So, we saw in Linda Barry's comic, at least the extract that you showed us from it, had this part about resilience, and she's not exactly being very sympathetic towards the idea of resilience being used, especially in the context of kids. And yet, we also see that several of these examples you use have kids in them, as, or at least childhood as a major trope. And the one that you ended with this slide that showed, I want to pick myself up, I at least want to try. So we are looking at hope as a very positive aspect, like you just spoke about. But we're also looking at a Linda Barry who is, at odds with this sort of optimistic, triumphalistic, outlook. And this is something that you find in illness narratives as well. So my question was rather, when you look at playfulness as something that these comics artists use in their work, and playfulness not just in terms of games or play as something that helps them cope, but as method itself, like Linda Barry does. How does that connect with ideas of resilience and hope, and being able to somehow overcome this feeling of hope being something that's farcical and something that's just out there to wash over the reality, like a media portrayal, a happy ending. So uh, they're very um, they're very antithetical ideas. The idea of using playfulness in a narrative about trauma, and yet wanting to convey some hope to those who need it, without hope becoming the overarching emotion, because that's not really the ground reality for somebody who's, for somebody who has a chronic disease, or for someone who's dying.
I think, I've heard, I couldn't hear you very well at the beginning, but I think I got most of it. Thank you very much for these thoughts. It's true that Linda Barry disregards resilience, and I think she distinguishes, and I do as well. I mean, resilience is a term that sometimes I don't feel comfortable with, because it implies that something good is going to come out of something really, really awful, and that we should all be happy about it, right? And the idea that trauma is always overcome no matter what, especially if it's in connection with young children that forget about things. That's the point that Linda Barry is trying to make, that they can overcome everything because they are very resilient, right? And she says, well, we are not, we simply continue, but the trauma is there, is a subtext in our life, it's subterranean, but it's still there. So we are still alive, as Onkawara would say, but the trauma is underneath the surface. I think the playfulness in Barry's style is not contradictory with this point, in the sense that she's in control of the situation. And the idea of giving visibility to monsters and to engage people with her own format, so to recreate with the same tools their own art practice, is something that she develops in her book Making Comics, for instance. She has many activities addressed to children that she has used in her practice as an educator, because she's also an educator, that include representations of monsters and things that are scary, but that you can more or less conjure or domesticate when you deal with them directly, when you draw them. So I think this playfulness is a way of domesticating this trauma and using it with a playful style, as in the sense that it's using it in the author's terms, and and she has the power to show what she wants to show or to hide what she wants to hide. And at the same time, we are a bit disoriented because we are looking at the bling bling. So I think she's creating a dissonance in purpose. So to see that sometimes that trauma can be, the trauma is always there, but that you can more or less manipulate it or domesticate it or hide it, not quite hide it, show it. So it's a game of play and of hide and seek, I think, in a searching way. And this idea of autobifictionalography in itself, the term that she gives to her work, to 100 Demons, is also a game of playing hide and seek. So I like this is something that is possible thanks to the form, as you were saying, because we need to infer. We have all this. We get so many meanings at the same time when we are reading a comic like this, because, as you have seen, the texts are very big sometimes in the strips, and the characters are cowering beneath them. So there is a lot of information there, but also collages were packed with information and packed with details. So I think she wants us to take a slow reading to focus on important stuff, but she also wants to manipulate us as readers to play hide and seek with us and not to see all about his trauma, but definitely denounce also this idea of resilience, which she doesn't accept. I don't know if I've been meandering too much through your question. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I don't know if there are other questions. There is a Shruti, but I think it's she forgot to, or perhaps she has a new question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I do actually have another question.
Sorry. No,
But,
go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, suppose there's a reader of another culture and the language, and he or she reads this graphic, let's say a graphic novel about another cultural language. Do you think the reader would be able to identify himself or herself with what is being narrated?
I think we do that all the time with comics and with books and with movies. For instance, if I think about coming of age stories in general, I guess, of course, a coming of age narrative can be very different depending on the cultural context, and we cannot forget about that cultural context. But at the same time, it has like different milestones in the development of a character, in how the story is arranged, that can allude to the viewer or to the spectator, or to the reader, because a coming of age is always the story of childhood into adulthood. So an adult reader or a teenage reader is going to know what the story is about, even if it doesn't point at the same markers, cultural markers, or the events that the story is narrating are very different, far call from what they have undergone in their own life. But I think there are these narrative traits. There are narrative traits that help us to raise empathy, and I think the use of the coming of age motif is one of them, for instance. I don't know if I answered your question or if there is another.
No, you did. It was good.
Thank you. Christina adds in the chat, the porousness in the reading process between readers and characters embodying stories has a strong potential, I think. Yes, the comment, definitely. And definitely, yeah. We all have bodies after all, so it's not difficult to project ourselves into those representations of embodiment. I don't know if you have more questions. I'll be here as long as the organizers have me, so I'm open to any intervention.
If there are no more questions from the audience, we can maybe invite Professor Nair or Professor Kurian, the faculty fellow, for a formal vote of thanks. Professor Anna Kurian of the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, who is a faculty fellow of the University Chair in Vulnerability Studies.
Hi. Yeah, so I've been copied in all the mails, Maria, but I have not really written, I think, through the entire process. I just kept in sync with what's going on. It's been a pleasure having you here today, and formal vote of thanks for the entire series is what I propose to do now. So, yeah, we started a month ago, less than a month, actually, exactly 4 weeks ago, and we have managed to do 5 talks in that period. These were organized, as everybody knows, under the UNESCO Chair for Vulnerability Studies, and we've been examining the portrayal of vulnerability in graphic novels and graphic fiction. It's been a terrific period because we had 3 practitioners, 2 academics speaking about this, and each of them has given us something more to think about. I think several of the students who have attended have found ready-made bibliographies. I think several of the students and research scholars who have been here have discovered new ways of looking at the wealth of material that is available out there. So I would like to formally thank Arjit Sen, Kate Evans, Arga Manna, Professor Susan Squire, and now Professor Maria Porras Sanchez for their work with us during this month. We are all of us very grateful. The chair itself has been enriched because of your contributions, and audiences have already started watching the videos, discovering the resources that are there. And this then remains an ongoing resource. It's not just that today one-off, but that because they are up on the website, people will be able to watch it, learn from it, and it augments, enriches the work of our chair as well. I, of course, also have to thank Meenakshi and Atul. They do all the work, they do all the running around, and they are the ones who make it possible for us to hold these events and to hold them seamlessly. So thank you to both Meenakshi and Atul. Final thanks, of course, to Pramod, who brought us the UNESCO chair and therefore then is spearheading this work. We thank you, all of you, once again, but especially today, I would once again like to thank Maria because she took time out. We juggled time. We juggled actually dates initially. I remember there was this problem that you would have preferred to have it in May because you were caught up through all of April, but then you managed to make us time, give us a date, and today has just been magical. Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you, everybody else as well. All of those who are here on this meeting, I thank you very much for attending. And those of you who asked for links for the other sessions, if you just go to the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, you will find all the videos are up there. We also have a YouTube channel where you can then go and watch these other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.